to take my picture off.
You're not going to start video.
Welcome, everybody. We are letting everybody in right now. So we're going to ask you to mute your microphones as we get started. But we're happy to see you today. So thank you for being with us. And we are just going to wait a couple minutes before getting started. Oh, Kathy Rosen, I didn't think you were going to be here.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Hi,
Hi.
good to see you all.
So good to see everyone.
Nice to see you all.
Circle. You want to see others, go to that circle at the end.
Ah, voila.
Voila.
I said, whenever I see you, Judy, it makes me
Oh,
smile.
one
You,
box is missing.
you taught me back to read.
Where's the other box?
Yes, I did.
It's nice to see you all.
Yes, but where's the other box?
I don't know anybody.
Isn't it a beautiful day today?
It's Jane Kaplan, I owe you an email.
It is beautiful.
It's
It
why
is.
you live in Florida.
Sometimes it's too hot, so I don't like living in Florida when that.
Well, I was in New York last week and it was pretty cold.
Oh,
So I'm glad I'm back.
Yeah, you keep going back, hit it, hit it. Hit it.
I don't want her.
What?
Um,
She'll disappear, you can't help that.
Okay, everybody, I am going to hit the mute all and then we're going to get started. So just leave it on mute for now, just because of the other noises that come in. And when it's time to talk, you can unmute. But I'm gonna go ahead and mute everybody right now. Okay. Hi, everybody. This is Debbie Hockman at the David Posnack JCC, welcoming you to yet another book discussion with Lynda Levin, which is our partnership program with the Friends of Sterling Road Library. And this is really one of the highlights of every month, really, for me and hopefully for Lynda too.
Sure.
I do really enjoy that you all come together around a book, and Lynda always, the lovely Lynda Levin always does a beautiful job with the book discussion. And we are just so happy that you keep coming. Just to let you know a little we had talked about the last time we were together that we thought that the library was going to be able to do live book discussions starting in January. But it seems that that is not going to happen starting in January. So for right now, we are going to continue virtual book discussions every month. Next month, we're doing the Book of Names, a Book of Lost Names by Kristen Harmel. And then in January, it is The Best We Could Do, right? Is that it?
Right. It's the big read. Everybody's going to be reading that in the county in terms of the Broward County libraries. Mhm.
And then
What was the name of it, Deb?
The Best We Can Do by T. Bui, B-U-I. I don't know if I messed up that pronunciation, but nonetheless, hopefully in January, we'll have different news if we will be able to start some live book discussion. But for now, just mark your calendars for December and January that you'll be joining us online the third Tuesday of each month, and the registrations will be available for you to sign up so you can get the link. And I saw a couple of people that didn't get the link on, so I'm happy to see you guys got the link from me later. And at this point, I'm going to turn over to the lovely Lynda Levin, and
Great.
we'll start. Thanks.
Good. Okay. So the books are available at the library, by the way, the upcoming books. So be sure to go ahead and contact the library, okay, if you're interested in that. Okay. By the way, the January book is different because it's an illustrated, like a graphic novel, like the kids are all reading. So it's going to be kind of fun to read something in a very different way of reading than we're used to. So that'll be a fun conversation for us in terms of that style. So I am looking forward to all of your comments and your discussion today. And some of you I know have not read the book. So I'm going to give you a summary, and I think there's enough to talk about in the book that you will enjoy it. And I'm curious, how many of you actually did, those of you that did read the book, how many of you did enjoy it? Put like a show of hands, how many of you enjoyed it? Yes? Okay, I see a few people shake. How many of you thought it was sort of so-so, or no's? Yeah? Okay, well, I'm hoping that after today's discussion, you will enjoy it that much, a little bit more. You should know, I don't know if you looked online, but the book received rave reviews, and this is a very up and coming author, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about her right now, okay? Her name is Ya Gyasi, and I had to look and see how to pronounce everything. She was born in Ghana in 1989, raised in Huntsville, Alabama. She holds a BA in English from Stanford and an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. And she's won all kinds of awards, and she is now dividing her time between Berkeley, California, and New York City. Her debut novel was called Homegoing. Did anybody read that one? Homegoing? Well, it had rave reviews also, and it was, and now her second, that was published in 2016, and this novel, Transcendent Kingdom, came out in 2020, and again, both of them rave reviews. What makes it interesting is that the author has done two very different kinds of books. The first one, she did a sweeping story of generations, sort of an epics kind of book, and she immersed herself in the study of slavery. She went back to Ghana, and she really did a whole thing on slavery. In Transcendent Kingdom, instead of a generational epic, she goes and she delves very deeply, as you know, into one family. And she's asking questions we've all asked ourselves. She's asking those universal questions. And in this book, the main character is struggling for answers. And you'll see that in a way, Ya Gyasi is doing the same thing in her life. There have been a lot of interviews online with the author. NPR did them, all of the newspapers. And in one of them, the author tells how this book, Transcendent Kingdom, came to be. She says she was really lucky. She happened to have had a very dear friend from Alabama who was, in fact, a 6-year PhD candidate. And guess what she does? She works with mice at Stanford in neuroscience in a research lab. And she is specifically studying neural pathways of reward seeking. Sound familiar if you read the book? It's the same thing as this main character, Gifty. And very similarly to Gifty, this is a very intellectual little scientist, and she has to deal with this mother of hers that comes and is very religious. She comes from Ghana, and of course, it's how they learn to communicate and relate to one another. And Gyasi tells us that her friend had to answer a lot of questions about science because that's not Gyasi's background, but she wants us to know that this book has a wonderful primary source because her friend answered all of her questions in great detail. So now Ya Gyasi, the author, is 31 years old. And as we mentioned, she came to the States as a very young child. Her father was a professor, her mother a nurse, and the family moved from Ohio. They went to Illinois, Tennessee, and wound up in Alabama. She says the first thing her mother and father did when they moved to a new community was they reached out to other people from Ghana. So they had a very tight community. That didn't really happen in Alabama. There weren't so many people there. She says, but her parents really kept alive their native country within their home. She says that as a child, she had some trouble straddling both of her identities. She always felt that she was not Ghanaian enough, but she was also not wholly American. So like the main character, Gifty, in the book, the author was raised in Alabama within this very predominantly white, very right-wing Pentecostal church. And like Gifty in the book, the author herself stopped going to church when she was about 15 years old. And the author says she was really happy to write this book because it gave her the opportunity to explore her own conflicts that she has to this day about her childhood faith. Gyasi says her parents had no trouble continuing in this white right-wing church because their faith from Ghana was so rooted in them, and they really weren't even aware of any of the racism that was there. Race was simply not something that her parents thought about. Her parents saw themselves as Ghanaian rather than Black. So when it came time in Alabama to choose where to live, her parents had a choice. Should they go to the Black community, or should they go where there's the very best school for their daughter? And they chose to live in this very white community, this very white church, because to them, what was more important than her having Black friends in the Black community was to have the very best education. And the author is quick to point out that, of course, there is no equality in the schools, and that's why her parents had to make that choice. And for her, she says it was probably damaging in some way to be surrounded by people who did not look like her. In the several interviews that I listened to, the author speaks about racism on many levels. She says in Transcendent Kingdom, it was very important to her to write about a Black person who became addicted to opioids, because usually the only reason that opioids has become, she says, such an issue that people are now talking about is because it is affecting the white community, not just poor Black people. In the story, there are racial implications in that Nana does not get the kind of care or response from the community that he might have gotten had he been white. You should know that in an NPR interview, she says that although she herself never realized it, she was experiencing institutional racism. And as a result, the author says that she herself put a lot of emphasis on being academically excellent. She had to be seen as smart and successful. Now, looking back, she questions why did she feel this need to be twice as good as anybody else? Because now she realizes that those accomplishments still don't save a person from being Black. There is no, and she uses this line, by the way, that I'm going to tell you in her book as well. There is no amount of blazing brilliance that will exempt you from racism. Jassy is very strong about the need for more Black voices among writers and the publishing industries. She herself was very, very much motivated to become a writer by reading Toni Morrison. Of course, her book, Beloved, played a very big part in her decision to become a writer. A Los Angeles article says Jassy is considered, quote, one of the most original and insightful chroniclers of America among a new generation of writers. This book, according to so many reviewers, is described as exquisitely written and emotionally stirring. Okay, so let me give you just a very kind of a bare bones sort of a summary, but enough that we can have this discussion. Gifty is 28 years old, right? She's a 6th-year PhD candidate, like we said, in neuroscience. She's at Stanford, and she's studying reward-seeking behavior in mice and the neural circuits of depression and addiction. As the book opens, Gifty's hometown pastor has called her and said, "Your mother is suffering from a terrible bout of depression." We're going to learn it's the second time that mother has had this kind of depression. And your mother cannot leave her bed. So Gifty decides that her mother should move to California from Alabama, and she should come and stay with her, and maybe that will be helpful. And so what we see is that the mother, in fact, leaves her home in Alabama, comes to California, and she is now living in Gifty's bed in California. So this story is mostly told in flashbacks and memories, and that's how we learn about Gifty, the past, about her mother. As a child, we know that Gifty kept a journal. She wrote letters to God, and in those letters, she spoke about her father, who she calls the Chinchin Man. She refers to her mother as the Black Mamba, and she writes of her brother, Nana. Now, what we know about Nana was he was quite beautiful to look at. He was a gifted high school athlete who died of a heroin overdose after an ankle injury left him hooked on OxyContin. We learn that since her brother's death, her mother has suffered from this depression. In fact, the first time right after Nana died, the mother took to her bed. It was there in Alabama. Gifty was 11 years old. And what she remembers of that time is that her mother attempted suicide, and then Gifty was sent temporarily to stay with an aunt in Ghana until her mother healed. And the pastor assured her that God was going to heal her mother. And in fact, her mother did get better through the years, but now it has happened again. And now here's Gifty. She's 28, living in California, and she's faced with this second bout of depression that her mother is experiencing. So picture that Gifty has been determined to discover the scientific basis for the suffering that she sees all around her. So she's turning to the hard sciences for some answers to unlock the mystery of depression and addiction. And she's trying to find those answers through science because her childhood faith in this Pentecostal church has yet to provide them. So we're going to see that this is the story of Gifty as she's trying very hard to take care of her mother and at the same time to struggle and to come up with some answers for herself to make some sense of everything that she's lived through. So now your turn. What would you say are some of the themes in the story? Go ahead, unmute yourselves. Yeah,
Mental illness.
Lillian, oh, go ahead.
Mental illness.
Mental illness
And
for
the
sure.
Lack-
difficulty of overcoming it.
Yes, the difficulties, right. Jillian, you had something?
Well, it's family bonds or the lack of them or family
Right.
sympathy
Right,
with, her mom was very, as they said with her aunt was very warm and hugging and her mom was just very
so
distant.
that, exactly.
So, and depression, yeah, there's a lot of depression in this book.
Right. What else? Any other themes that you saw? Eleanor?
Religion.
Religion, for the importance of her faith, right? Her conflict with faith. Absolutely. Marilyn, I see you.
It's not only religion that I think it's the balance between religion and science. What is more important? She wants either of them to give her the answer. And quite honestly, neither of them really does. But I think she explores this throughout the book.
Yeah, that's one of her main struggles for sure. Anybody else?
Lynda, Jackie wrote in family and self-confidence.
Yeah,
Those were two
for
others.
sure. For sure.
Certainly addiction was a key theme throughout this story.
Addiction for sure.
Yeah.
The author says too, she really wanted to highlight the whole idea of communication between these family members that you've been talking about, how important that is. And there's a great deal of loss in this story, isn't there? In many different ways, we see the loss. What did you think of the style of writing? Let's begin first, the time periods, how they kind of went back and forth. Why do you think the author did it that way instead of just telling it straight on chronologically?
Well, I think it makes it a lot more interesting, first of all, but it just melded together and gave more purpose to the storyline for me.
Yeah, for you.
I didn't like how it just went back and forth. Like in mid-page, it would jump too much. I mean, she couldn't just tell you the whole story. I know that. So she had to do a little bit back and forth, but I would have appreciated if it was in a different font or something when she was going back to the younger child, because she'll be in school, but she was in school in PhD school, but she was in school in middle school or high school, or it just kept jumping for me. That was the one thing of this book I did not like is that writing style.
Right. Any other thoughts on that? So for me, what I was thinking about was, it was sort of the way memories are. It was just so much of what she experiences. It's her memories are being jogged by her mother showing up and also by what she's doing with the mice. And so different things come to her and for all of us, the way memories just come, your memory is just sort of jogged by an occurrence. So that was the only thing I could think of. And in the same way as you discussed about mental illness being a theme, mental illness doesn't go in a linear fashion either. So I thought that was possibly one of the reasons why she chose to present the story this way. Anything else you want to say about the style? First of all, were you engaged? Those of you that said no, was that one of the problems, that you felt you were not engaged in the story? What was it? For me, I'll just tell you, I did love her use of language. And when you really look at her language, in fact, it's funny because there are so many quotes. I realized I had pages and pages of notes that I jotted down. They were all quotes because I thought the language was so beautiful. Just looking at that very first sentence of the story, whenever I think of my mother, I picture a queen-size bed with her lying in it, a practiced stillness filling the room. For months on end, she colonized that bed like a virus. The first time when I was a child, and then again when I was a graduate student. So the idea of colonizing it like a virus. I mean, I thought her language was really quite informative and descriptive. Any other thoughts that you had about her sense of the style of writing? Judy, you had something?
I didn't love, I don't like mice at all. So reading about mice and their behavior, just pick another animal, any other animal.
Okay. So she lost you at the mice. Okay.
Yes, yes.
What about her letters to God? What did that add to the story, do you think?
I liked her letters to God. And I thought her writing was quite extraordinary, really. But I just had a really hard time with this story. I had a hard time emotionally with this story. And I just kept finding myself, I just wanted it to be over because it was so painful.
It was
and
painful.
it was so dark. And I just didn't see any hope. And, you know, at the end, I felt better because she was married and seemed to be, for the first time, happy in her life.
But it was a dark story till you got to that point.
It was too dark for me. And I really understand. I'm no fan of mice either, but I'm also not a great fan of people doing experiments on animals. And that really bothered me too. Although I understand cognitively why that's important, but.
So Kathy, you're bringing me right to my next thought. I want to talk to you a little bit about the science, okay? So first of all, were some of you overwhelmed by the science? Was it too much for you? That's number one, perhaps you could answer that. What was she actually doing to these mice would be the second part of the question. And the third thing is, how did she feel about what she was doing? So I know a lot of us were turned off by it, but first of all, what was she doing to the mice? What was she doing?
Experiments.
Leslie, what kind of experiments? What was she actually doing to them?
She was trying to find out if she could stop an addicted mouse from doing the addiction, eating the Ensure.
Right. She was actually giving them Ensure and asking them to press a lever, and they would press it and they would get the Ensure, right? And then she started to give them mild shocks on their foot, and some of the mice at that point stopped pushing the lever, right? But many kept coming, and then she would give them more and more shocks. And then as time went on, some of these mice, of course, stopped coming and hitting the lever. However, there were those that came back day after day, shock after shock, and they were still pressing the lever to get that Ensure. And of course, that's what she was interested in, to find out which neurons were firing or not firing when those mice continued to press the lever. What else? How did she, here she was doing this to them and injecting dye and all of that. So how did she feel about it?
She was very, very interested in this because she was doing this experiment, I believe, because of her brother. And to find out, how he could be so addicted and so destructive. She had very mixed feelings about it, I think. I mean, she didn't want to hurt the mouse. She felt bad about the crippled one. I did too. But she knew that this was the only way they could find this out because she said, we can't do it on people yet,
Exactly. So she tried sometimes, she used very clinical language sometimes when she was describing what was happening with this, with what she was doing. She scolded herself when she started to humanize them. And yet, if you remember, one day she sees this mouse that's going to die because he was torn apart by this other mouse, and she feels bad, and she actually starts crying, right? And Han walks in the room, Han or whatever, he walks in the room. He says, what's wrong with you? What does she say to him? Bad date. She can't tell the truth that she's crying over the mouse, so she says a bad date. To me, I felt like there was a certain part of her that was sort of transferring sometimes some of these feelings about what was going on at home with her mother, and the way she was also being a caretaker for these mice as well. But I feel like she actually felt, and she says at one point, that her work with the mice is holy and sacrosanct. She says, what would she know of the brain without them? So she realizes what she's doing to her is also holy and sacrosanct. And again, you see this pull of faith that she's experiencing as well. Why do you think she calls the book Transcendent Kingdom? Any thoughts on that? Why it's called Transcendent Kingdom?
It's on page 21.
But,
The only animal who believed he had transcended in his kingdom. As one of my high school, that's the only place I heard it
yeah,
in the book, was where she mentions Transcendent Kingdom and
right,
transcendence.
right. And she says that she was actually taught growing up that God gave us dominion over the animals without ever being taught that I myself was an animal. So the whole idea that she is struggling with is the idea that what makes a person a person. And growing up with faith, she was always told it was the soul. And now all of a sudden, what does she realize when she's studying science? That it's really a lot of the brain. It's all brain. It's all the brain. And so she writes at one point, it awed her to see the brains of the mice. She wanted to extrapolate whatever she learned from their brains in order to apply it to those of us who made up the species Homo sapien, the most complex animal, the only animal who believed he had transcended his kingdom. Okay, so
What page was that on? What page was that on?
I think that line was not from page 21. I don't know, that might have been later on in the book. Yeah. So what do we know? Let's talk a little bit about the characters, okay? And then I want to talk about some of the issues in the book when she talks about racism, she talks about addiction. But let's first talk about Gifty's mother, the Black Mamba. What do we know of her? And I want to divide it up between what do we know of her before Nana's addiction, and then after his addiction and after his death. But what do we know of her before the mother? Can you remember back in the story, what do we know of her? Even in Ghana, what do you remember hearing about her?
Very.
Marilyn, unmute.
Oh, I am unmuted.
Okay, go ahead. Now we can
hear you now.
I remember that she was just very religious, that everything was going to be solved through religion. And she was really very dependent and really believed it. And
So
I think that sustained her.
Exactly. What else? So very religious. What else? Very strong. She's the one who wanted to leave, right? She had her son, Nana. He was so beautiful. She wanted him to have the best. Her relative lived in Alabama. She wins the lottery. She leaves with Nana. And her husband.
Very focused. She was very focused.
Very focused. What else about her?
She was very hardworking. I mean, she worked day and night practically. She was very, she was a caretaker. She was very, very involved and loved her children, well, loved him, you know, and unfortunately didn't seem to love Gifty as much. It happens, you know, in families. I don't know if I may have missed something at the beginning, but I just wanted to say that I loved this book. And I thought that she was one of the most fully drawn characters I've ever encountered. And I just feel like I really know her. I not only know her thoughts, but I know her feelings and I know her sufferings. And I thought that was amazing that the author could get that across, you know, to me, the reader.
And a lot of the reviewers have all agreed with you in terms of the way she drew those characters, both Gifty and the mother. You mentioned, Leslie, that she worked very hard. And remember that she was a caretaker for Mr. Thomas, and he was an all-out racist. Do you remember that? He called her the N-word all the time. He said that her son was a little monkey. He was pretty awful. In fact, even at his funeral, his own kids said, our father was really an awful man. And they felt sorry for her that she had to work for him. The other thing about her mother, she really was the immigrant. She really was an immigrant. She never really felt comfortable or adjusted to America. She was somehow suspicious of a lot of things that were American. What else about her? Well, go ahead.
One thing that came through to me is that her culture was extremely important to her. It was really central to her identity.
Right. It was. And
I thought she loved.
Yeah, Diane.
I thought she did love her children, but she was not affectionate. She didn't pander to them in any way.
Nothing warm and fuzzy about her, right? Okay, never one for hugging, and of course the children sort of inherit that as well.
Yeah.
And the mother has a lot of. She's very thrifty with money, but I thought one of the very moving things was we're going to hear the Chinchin Man. The father leaves them early on, right? And do you remember this part of the story where at one point Nana is eating a lot, he's growing, and she's realizing that he's eating them out of house and home, and she goes ahead and she waters down the orange juice. She's hiding snacks from them. So she's very thrifty, but on another occasion, Nana, they're taking this, she goes on the team bus. Now, usually she can't even go to his soccer games, right? Even though he's this gifted little soccer player, because she's working. But this day she takes the day off. She goes on the team bus. They drive 2 hours. And of course, Gifty, who was like 3 years old, was really acting out on the bus. And so it was a very difficult bus ride. And all of a sudden they get to the other team's field. And what happens? Do you remember?
Yes, he doesn't want to play.
He doesn't want to play.
And she doesn't yell at him.
She doesn't
after all
yell
that.
at him. Right. She
Right.
doesn't yell at him. You see that she's actually a pretty astute person, because instead she just says, okay, you don't want to play, we won't play. And they take the Greyhound bus back. And she never mentions that she had taken the day off, that she had scrimped and saved for even to pay the soccer league and couldn't get any refunds, and never says a word about that. Because what does she realize is finally hitting Nana? It took him all this time to realize that his father wasn't going to be in the stands,
Right.
and his father was never coming back. So she realizes this impact on him. So she is sensitive, although she certainly doesn't show it in most cases. So tell us now, how does she change after he becomes addicted? So he hasn't died yet, he's just addicted, but how painful it is. Do you remember what goes on after all of a sudden the addiction? How's she feeling?
Desperate. She goes, she looks for him. She will not believe it in some ways. And
they're
there's nothing
driving
she won't
around
do.
all the time looking.
Right.
That's right. What else? But what else as a mother would you feel? What? How about guilt? She feels so guilty that she didn't stop him when she first saw that he was on the OxyContin and he wanted a refill. And of course he moves on to heroin, but it certainly starts with the OxyContin, right? So she feels tremendous guilt. And also she feels guilty because the Chinchin Man had wanted to take him to Ghana and she didn't permit it. And now she looks back on it and she thinks perhaps she should have done that. And of course, she's still turning to prayer to save him. And now the prayer doesn't work. He dies. And what happens to mother? What happens to the Black Mamba?
She falls apart.
Totally falls apart. Exactly.
Gets so depressed.
So depressed. Tries suicide. What else? She has suffered so many losses. The Chinchin Man, right? Her husband has gone back. Now her son is gone. She feels she's losing her daughter to her mother. Daughter isn't praying the way she wants her to. She's losing her to America. And she's able to not communicate any of this to anyone, this type of depression. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that caused these losses. And one of them is the Chinchin Man. So I want to talk a little bit for a moment about him. And he's in the story for a very specific purpose, I think. What do we see in the Chinchin Man?
You're on mute, Lynda. Lynda, you went on mute for a second.
Yeah, okay. What do we see about the Chinchin Man? How physically describe him? He is what?
Tall.
He is tall. He is big. He is right. And so he's an easygoing guy. He goes to Ghana to follow his wife and his son, and he wants to be with them, but he comes to America. And what happens to him here?
He doesn't have a life here.
Why no life? Why no life?
Hard to get a job. He had
Can't
like
get a
in
job.
school. Right.
Can't get a job. What else?
He
was
just
so
really doesn't
tall.
fit in.
He was so tall that people were not hiring him and they were not sure of who he was. And I think we're afraid of him because
That's
he's so big.
Judy, that's exactly right. She says there that her mother, the Black Mamba, quote, saw how America changed around big Black men. He was so large that people were actually afraid of him. And so how about this story? Do you remember what would happen when he went to Walmart? In 3 months, 4 times.
They kept checking to see if he stole something.
Exactly. They kept patting him down and humiliating him until finally she says, Gifty says, she saw him try to shrink his size, his long, proud back hunched as he walked with her mother through Walmart. So you see that he was really very much the victim of racism, right? And so he's missing Ghana, where people would have greeted him on the street, he says, rather than turn away from him. He misses his family. So I guess it's no surprise, of course, that he goes back to visit his brother ostensibly and in fact does not return.
It was even more poignant, I think, Lynda, because they chose Alabama. If they'd chosen a New England state, that the whole story would have not worked. But the fact that it's Alabama,
right?
So many of these things work because that's the way those southern states, unfortunately, and I'm from a southern state, they were really like that.
Right, right.
But I think in a way that's a little bit unfair because there's racism everywhere. We've lived all over and we're from a southern state also. I think that was kind of a catch-all to put it in a southern state. It just worked better in a southern state.
It worked
to be
better.
honest.
You're right. You're
right. Remember one thing also, the author grew up in Huntsville, Alabama. So she wrote about what she knew. She lived in California, she lived in Alabama. So she set the two settings would be, of course, where she knew.
And I think that she really brought in the Chinchin Man and his story because she wants to deal with immigration for immigrants in the United States.
Yes.
That was her perception of what it was, but that's the way she saw the immigration problem.
Immigration and something else.
Racism.
That's exactly right. Because she tells very specifically the story about how they go to the one game and all of a sudden he's a very terrific, he's the only Black boy on the team and he's an amazing player. And one of the fathers on the opposing team yells to his son, he says, don't you let those N-word, don't let them beat us. You better get out there and you better stop him. He's yelling to his own son on the opposing team. And all of a sudden, Nana, the boy looks at his father with a questioning look and she says, I don't know how my father answered his look. But I'll tell you, I think I do know, because my brother got out there and he began to play with fury and he scored goal after goal after goal. And afterwards, she says her brother and she were so happy because their father was so happy that they had won. And she says, you would think that we would have forgotten what that guy yelled. But she says, in fact, we didn't. And it was a lingering memory. They were the only 3 Black people on the team. And everyone had been looking at them. And so it was a memory that they couldn't forget. And the Chinchin Man couldn't forget it. But she says, Gifty says she was young. But she says, the lesson from that day that I have never been able to shake is that I would always have something to prove. And that nothing but blazing brilliance would be enough to prove it. Right. So in other words, this idea that you just really want to be better than everybody else so that you will be accepted.
She did say that about her degrees, that she had her degree from Harvard and from Stanford, and that everyone should know that. But she wasn't that kind of person, very showy.
No.
But I wanted to find out how much of this, I mean, I know she grew up in Alabama. She did go to Stanford, the real, Giassi. But you said she was an only child. She didn't have a brother. I'm just wondering if
she did have siblings, but a lot the addiction and all of that, I believe, was fictionalized. She doesn't speak of that.
No, about the racism in the
Oh,
sporting
no,
events.
No, the racism was definitely true. She, in all of her interviews, I can give you some more information at the end after we're done talking about the book if you'd like, but she gives a lot of interviews about racism, how she feels about it. And yeah, she's very outspoken about that. And so that was definitely part of her life growing up also.
So she experienced it, but not as a sibling, not her own sibling. And
Yeah, she doesn't say, I don't know that that's a fact, Jillian, but I know that she's experienced it. She doesn't talk about any specifics with her family, right? But
I
she
have a question.
was part of the traditional racism. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. I live across the street from people that are from Guyana, which I believe is in South America. And I was confusing through the whole book whether these people were from Guyana or from Ghana. Where are they from? Ghana?
Ghana, not Guyana.
Ghana, Africa. There's Guyana that was, we
South
had somebody
America.
who worked for us who was from Guyana, but she was Indian. So
Yes, they are have Indian background, but here's the thing.
Guyana, only if they're from Suriname. There's French Guiana, British Guiana, and Dutch Guiana. Probably the Dutch Guiana are the ones that have the, anyway, it doesn't matter, but the Guiana were belonging to 3 different European countries, or 3 different cultures.
But what I wanted to say was that people that live across the street from me, they're very, very dark, but they do not look African American. They have very American features. They're, extremely attractive people, as a matter of fact. And I was wondering, did the people that are portrayed in this story, do they look African American, or do they look American and just dark? Do you have any knowledge of that?
I don't. I know that the parents did not consider themselves really Black. Again, the author talks about the fact that race was not important to them, but the children saw themselves as Black. It sounds like she and her siblings, the author and her sibling, would have thought that they were Black. Yeah. So I don't know in terms of physically how they look.
But they kept saying that she was
they're very
pretty.
beautiful. We know that they're very beautiful. We know that he for sure was very beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Unless I misunderstand, a lot of people who do come over from Africa do not consider the color of their skin until they come to England or the United States or wherever, where they are introduced to racism, but they don't really understand that when they are in their indigenous country.
Right, because they're surrounded by people who look like them, exactly, and she makes that point in many of her interviews, that nobody really, and when she went to Ghana, there is no such thing as racism there. Yeah,
right.
When she goes back to Ghana.
I wanted to say, Lynda, there's one other thing when you were talking before about how Gifty had to feel that she was better than anybody to succeed. That's just not for people from Ghana. That's from any minority. I don't care what your minority is, whether you're Asian, you're Jewish, you're Black, you're brown, you're whatever it is. I mean, that's universal feeling for any minority, I think.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, she certainly feels it. She's driven by it. The author herself was driven by it, and certainly Gifty, the character, is driven by that. Talk a little bit about Nana. What do we know about him? Of course, we know his death changes everything, but what about before that? Talk about how he was. I mean, we know he was very beautiful, and he was the miracle baby after all these years of infertility. The parents had him. Anything you want to talk about with him, Nana?
Well, I think he was quite spoiled, and I think he was very dominant in the family, very dominant over Gifty. And he really thought he was hot stuff.
Yeah.
And he was in many ways.
And he was, right. Picture that he was the star, that he was idolized, that he was called up all the time to do the readings in the church, right? Everybody just thought he was really quite amazing. And then he goes ahead and he tears a ligament in his ankle and he's given OxyContin. So what happens? Here you have this amazing rising star where everybody says, oh, he's got an amazing future in basketball, right? And all of a sudden, he's now addicted. How do the people at the church respond?
Horribly.
Horribly.
Horribly. In fact, they overheard a conversation saying, well, they're kind. This is what more can we expect from their kind, sort of thing, which is very disgusting.
Right. And again, the racism coming forth. What else? They're all gossiping, right? And the pastor no longer calls him up to do the readings. And all of a sudden, even his own team, when he starts to play again and he's horrible because he's addicted, his own team starts to boo him. And you see what a fallen star he now is. And someone yells from the stands, where'd this effing coon learn how to play? So all of a sudden, he's gone from this star to all of a sudden this kind of language being addressed to him. And of course, his death is shrouded in shame, Gifty tells us. And so what happened? People didn't know what to say. So what'd they do?
They didn't say anything, right?
They stayed away. And they lived in the town for 15 years. They rented out the Elks Lodge for his funeral. And what happened? Half full, half full. And anybody who ever talks about him, all they can remember is what?
Sports.
His
His
addiction.
athletic.
His
Or,
addiction.
oh, right,
All
right.
they can remember is his addiction. Exactly. So we've got Gifty now. I want to talk about Gifty because Gifty was always smart as a child. She's growing up. She knows she was always second best, right? She's very close to her brother. She idolizes him. What else is unique about Gifty as a child?
She's very smart.
Very smart.
So smart. What else? She's so religious. She's so religious as a child, right? She talks about that she tried to be blameless as Jesus, that she prayed unceasingly. She prayed and she would pray over animals. She wanted to be a worship leader, and then she realized maybe the ministry wasn't for her, but she was so religious as a child. And she wrote these letters to God. And I love one of the letters which she says, dear God, I know you're with me. I just want to know exactly where are you? Are you in space? If you're in space, I want to go there. So she really is always in search of him. And remember how remember this expression, she feels a knock? What do they mean by that? Do you remember? She feels the knock. Her mother keeps dragging her to church, and she goes, but her mother, she's not ready to be saved, to be baptized. But one day she's in 4th grade, she goes by herself to church after school, and all of a sudden she feels this knock in her because she really feels so connected, feels that God is now in her heart. And she responds to this knock by walking down the aisle, going to the front of the church, and accepting Jesus. And she is, at that point, she is saved. So she's a very religious little girl, which makes it all that much sadder when her brother becomes addicted. And what happens to Gifty at that point when she starts to see her brother change addicted? What happens to her?
Well, doesn't she start to doubt her religion?
Absolutely. God, where are you? She's saying, God, you used to hold the whole world in your hands. What's happening now? All of a sudden, we're fallen. Yeah. What else? So how is she affected at this point? And when she's a little girl, she's just with her mother. They're driving around trying to find her brother. But most of all, she feels what emotion? She feels shame. She feels such shame. She says, I am full to the brim of it. I am spilling over. She continues to have this shame all the way into her adulthood, into her neuroscience training. She says, I can look at data again and again. To this day, I can look at scan after scan of drug-addicted brains shot through with holes, Swiss cheese, atrophied, irreparable. I can watch that blue light flash through the brain of a mouse and note the behavioral changes. And yet, I still think, why didn't Nana stop? Why didn't he get better for us, for me? She feels such shame. She won't even tell anybody about her brother, right? She denies that she has a brother. And when she's a little girl, she tells one of her friends. And what happens?
She leaves her friend.
Yeah. And the friend won't, by the way, when she's a little girl, one of the friend's mothers won't even let the kid come over and play because she thinks it's contagious. So she's learned early on to keep it a secret. But most of all, everything about her is changed. She's afraid to touch alcohol when she gets to college. She says addiction, she feels it was waiting for her like a man in a dark trench coat stalking her. Great imagery there, right? She's so fearful. Yeah, Jackie, did you have your hand up?
I did. I was going to say, I just don't think any of this is that unusual, though. I think anytime something major happens in a family, a sudden death, this drug addiction, anything we can't actually wrap our hands around, people tend to start questioning their faith. They question everything. I don't see that is, I don't know. I didn't feel the angst for her as much because I think that everybody goes through that when they have something major in their life happen. And I also think a lot of people feel the same way trying to react to it. How many of us know somebody whose child has a drug addiction or may have killed themselves after a drug addiction? What do we say? All we really say is we're really sorry because we don't know what to say.
That's right. Or worse yet, a lot of people stay away, Jackie, right? Yeah. You know, Jackie, I think one of the reasons this book was as well received as it was, I think it's very relatable, as you say, because so many people have been touched by these kinds of things. And I think that's one of the reasons the book has been so well received. Yeah.
The other thing that really hit me is that, and I agree with you, Jackie, that when something like this happens in a family, you just go under. You don't want to be around people. You don't want to talk about it. I've seen this happen again and again. They just go under. And it makes it much harder to be a friend to someone. And of course, Gifty had nobody to be her friend, really. She didn't have a true friend except Han eventually. But I agree.
And Catherine was her real friend.
Yes, Catherine was a friend. Yeah.
I love Catherine.
Right.
But Gifty, I think, had it to the extreme. I think she really was so extreme. She didn't even know how to talk to people. She didn't know how to be with people. Having worked with Asperger kids, I was kind of wondering if maybe she had some of that because, you know, they're very, very bright, but they don't have the social graces. And she certainly didn't have them. She didn't know how to be at a party or how to be with even a girl who was such a good friend to her. She just didn't know how to relate when she asked her about her brother. It was just so extreme, really.
She was so hidden. She was so, Marilyn, did you have something?
You're muted, Marilyn. Marilyn, you're muted.
In addition to that, Leslie, I think you also, I really think that she had a big trust issue that she had to overcome. So I think it was a combination of the two, and she had to learn to accept help from Catherine, and that took a long time.
It did. I thought it was so painful when she has this friend Anne first. Remember this Anne? And Anne finally breaks through to her and gets her to tell, and she tells about her brother. And Anne starts crying. Anne is feeling her pain. And what's Gifty's response?
She exits. She's gone.
That's right. She's so angry. She thinks, wait a second, what's she crying about? What can she relate to?
That scene bothered me, by the way.
Right.
Because her brother died of addiction. And here, this girl, I mean, she didn't know about the brother yet, but they have mushrooms. Like, why would Gifty like try drugs after seeing what happened to her brother? That bothered me that she would go that route, you know, while I think she was in Harvard at that time. I'm not quite sure where she was because of the way that
right.
But
also, didn't she have a lesbian relationship with Anne?
That was Anne said she loved her. Anne said to Gifty she loved her.
Yeah.
Right.
That was kind of
so in the end she feels that nobody can understand what she's gone through, right? So in the end she drops Anne. right? She won't even respond to her at all. She won't respond to her. And in the same way, by the way, you know something what we haven't mentioned? How about her relationship with men?
Raymond, she didn't tell
really bad.
Raymond about her brother
Oh,
or her
Raymond, she outright
family.
lies to Raymond.
Except
She
that-
doesn't tell him about her brother. But what else was interesting? Even before Raymond, she would go out on dates with guys. What would happen? She'd have a sexual relationship with them one time. They would text her, they would write her, they wanted to see her again. And what would she do?
Ignore it.
Ignore
Ghost
it.
them. She
She
ghosted
felt
them.
she loved seeing their names, she says, on her phone. They would text, they would call. She felt this power that she had never felt before. This power, she loved that she never responded to them. So she really had deep-rooted problems with intimacy, no question about that.
Can you explain to me, Lynda, the last, 2 pages, where does it say they got married? It just says that from our
Maybe
house
they
in New
didn't.
Jersey.
So we don't know that they got married.
Oh,
Maybe they
okay.
did.
Oh,
I
no, someone
assume
had
that.
mentioned, her marriage was a high.
Yeah.
Okay, but it does say, when you mention that word, the knock, that's
Yeah.
the last page of the book. Han has never heard the knock, so he'll never know what it means to miss that sound, to listen for it. So I'm glad you explained again what the knock was, because at the end of the book, I'm like, what was the knock? It was God knocking.
She was trying to describe the feeling that came over her, that overwhelming feeling. So that's the way she described it. I thought some of the memories that she had of her faith were interesting. She had a lot of negative, she had this powerful, positive feelings, but she also had a lot of negative feelings. Do you remember anything that she talked about in terms of her Pentecostal upbringing? The strictness of it? I thought it was interesting when she talks, Nana, when he was going to church back in the day, Nana and she went and they were talking, and the pastor is talking, teaching them, and Nana asks the question, what if there's a tiny village in Africa where there are no Christians, they've never heard of the gospel, would they end up going to hell? And what does the pastor say?
Yes.
He says yes. And of course, what do they think? They realize those people in Africa look like them. And again, she's bringing a little bit of this racism piece in it. And Nana never goes back to church after that because he feels it was the wrong answer. So she has these very negative feelings about the strictness. She talks about the pastor talking about sins of the flesh. Remember that? And then his own daughter gets pregnant when she's 17. She says, that he changed his tune. No longer did he talk about a punitive God. Then he talked about a forgiving God. And only later does she come to realize so much is interpretation. She never grew up. It was so literal that she never was aware of that. Till later she meets, I remember a woman from Harvard Divinity School, changes her whole feelings when she realizes that there are many ways of interpreting the Bible. And that's sort of one way in which she grows.
That was one of the things I liked so much about the book, is that she really had questions about God's existence. And there were times when she didn't think that there was a God.
Yeah.
And then, then her faith would come through. And I really, really related to that.
Right. So her conflict is very strong when she says, as people, we think about our heart giving us feelings, our brain giving us our mind, she says. But the truth is there is no separation. It all comes down to the brain. She writes here, our brains are our hearts that feel, and our minds that think, and our souls that are. There is no separation. It's all the brain. But then she says after that, but I still can't get over that. She says, my soul is still my soul. So you see where she is so conflicted. I love this part where she says she can never tell anyone how she thinks of faith and science because Christians would find it blasphemous and scientists would find it embarrassing, because she does have those, as she says, as she does her scientific work, her research with the mice, she believes in a kind of holiness in our connection to everything on earth. So I want to ask you now a little bit about the end of the book. Okay, what changes do we see in her in terms of her understanding before we get to the final chapter? Sort of what what changes do we see in Gifty?
She becomes mothering. She becomes like a mother to her mother.
She does. She does. She becomes the caretaker to her mother, even more so.
I have a question about that, Lynda. I wondered, with all of her intellectual talents, I just kept thinking, isn't there something else she could do to help her mother? I mean, her mother is languishing in bed. I know she had a terrible experience in the past when she went to an institution, but here she has Stanford Medical School and tremendous resources. And I just didn't understand how she could live with her mother being in bed all the time like that. It bothered me.
I think some of that's because it was her mother. I mean, think about it. Did any of us tell our mothers what to do? I don't really think so. So I think that was a huge issue for her because it was her mom.
I don't think there's anything much she could do. There's millions of people who suffer from depression that don't get out of bed, and nobody knows what part of the brain can turn that switch. I mean, it's a fact.
I know. I just kept thinking maybe there was a medication she could have taken, something. I understand because it's her mother, but on the other hand, I mean, it's her mother. And I would think if it were my mother, I'd want to do anything humanly possible to help her.
Right, and she does at one point reach out to Catherine, but she can't even bring herself to talk about it with Catherine. But she knows that, she can't, her mother she can't commit her. She really doesn't know what to do with her. I think that's really,
I know.
I agree. I see your point though. Yeah. But
did her mother even give her skills? I mean, she was not a mother. She was the mother from all the time. She really didn't have a mother. So she didn't have a lot of these role models at all.
These nurturing skills, you mean these? Yeah.
She had nothing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where did
she? Yeah.
That's true.
I think, Lynda, I think the reality is that in the area of depression, medicine is still in a very primitive state. We've made great strides, but it's still something that medicine cannot always solve. And so although she was, I'm sure wanted to get her mother out of bed, there was nothing she could do. And there was a certain acceptance of that. So that's how she managed to continue with her life, as it were, to some degree. And that's, I think, the reality. That's part of what I think she's showing here and saying here.
Yeah. And I think to a certain extent, her mother was refusing a lot of whatever she would have offered. I think she felt her mother would have refused. I love the idea that she eventually comes to realize that the tension, the idea that one must choose between science and religion is false. She says, I used to see the world through a God lens, and when that lens clouded, I turned to science. Both became for me valuable ways of seeing, but ultimately both have failed to fully satisfy their aim to make clear, to make meaning. So she can't find any answers at that point, right? And I love how she says she finally is thinking about her mother and her mother's devotion. And up till now, I think she's never really fully accepted it. And now she says, though I hadn't worked out how I felt about the Christianity of my childhood, I did know how I felt about my mother. Her devotion, her faith, they moved me. I was protective of her right to find comfort in whatever she saw fit. Didn't she deserve at least that much? We have to get through this life somehow. So she's kind of figuring out that, you know what, if her mother's way of getting through life is faith, then if it works for her, it's wonderful. So I want to talk a little bit about that very last chapter when we see her with Hen. Any comments on that last chapter? I loved one of the things that she did. The first thing she did is she reaches out to Catherine, which, by the way, is a big moving up for her, right? She's able to reach out to a friend. She realizes she can't do it alone. And she accepts the fact that Catherine says, I'm going to help you figure this out. So we see that she's reaching out. What else? So I love, yeah. Who was going to say something? I love the beginning of the last chapter when Han says to her, "Oh, the church bells are ringing. Your people are summoning you." So we see that she still has, he sees that faith in her. What do we see about Gifty in that last chapter?
She seems very human. She seems more
content. Yeah. It's sort of like, I felt like maybe the author added this at the end because she realized how painful this whole book was. We needed a little hope at the end because all of a sudden we see the Gifty's on her way to achieving. Remember, she said what she wanted. She wanted a lab of her own. She wanted a partner. She wanted a Nobel Prize. She wanted a house with a pool, a dog. At one point she lists what she wants. And what you realize is she got part of what she wanted so far. She has Han with her. She's a scientist with her own lab at Princeton. And most of all, to me, what was the most hopeful was about Han. Why was it so hopeful what she had going with him?
Because I think she, go ahead.
I was going to say, I loved when he asked her to dinner for the first time and she said, "I'm terrible at relationships." And he said, "Well, how are you at eating?" And I thought that was such a great line. He was a good match for her.
Right. Anything else?
She was comfortable with him. She was very comfortable. They worked together in that lab, just the two of them and the mice. So.
Right. And she says, he was one person because they'd worked together, as you say, Jillian. He really understood her work. He understood her obsessions. He knew about her family. And she realizes in him, she really has someone who understands her and understand where what she's, how large her struggle was. So what is the significance of the last line when Gifty lights 2 candles in the church? What was the significance of that, do you think?
It was for her mom and her brother, I think.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So I loved it because I thought it really also signified the fact that here she had come from a full day at the lab where she did all of her scientific research, but yet what does she do? She still loves to hang out in the church. And she says she doesn't pray anymore, not the way she used to pray, but she loves the blessed silence and she sits there trying to figure things out. But yet she finds this sacred space important to her still.
But it also mentions about her mom dying and her mom in the hometown, her childhood home with her mom's caretaker. That just came out of wait, what? She hired a caretaker for her. It was when did she go back? How long did she live in California? It was kind of it just was thrown in there type of thing. So.
But I think what it indicates too, I feel like it was a bit abrupt, but I think she wanted to finish it up for us. But I think it showed how her mother did survive the time in California. She was able to get a caretaker. Going back to Kathy, what you were saying about she could have done better for her mother, perhaps. In this case, the caretaker was taking care of her mother there in her own home. And Han, of course, goes with her when her mother dies. So you see that it really is kind of completed in a nice full circle type of way. I thought what was interesting in the book also is her statements about addiction are very, very clear. What do you think the author's takeaway message is here?
Well, I just want to know, when my children got their wisdom teeth out, the doctor prescribed a painkiller. And I filled it, but I never gave it to them because I've heard so many stories about, it just takes, a few for kids to get addicted to it. And I never wanted them to have that. There's a lot going on now. I mean, our sisterhood book review is about Painkiller, Empire of Pain. It's all about the addiction. There are 2 shows. There's one on HBO Max called Crime and Punishment, all about the opioid and OxyContin. And there's another show on Hulu called Dope Sick.
Excellent.
So all about this opioid and how awful it is and how it all started out with a simple injury. And that's what she writes about. Nana's little injury on his ankle caused the downfall of him and his mother too. So it's really, I think that's what she was trying to show, don't get started, you know.
And
on
how the
something.
whole family, as you say, how the whole family pays the price. Yeah.
I just want to quickly say that when my son was born, I was sent home with Percocet. And it took a lot of pulling strings for the doctor to send it home with me. It really helped me. And what was happening is that I'd wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning, I'd take one, and I think, okay, I get another one at 7 o'clock at night. And pretty soon I was feeling so good. And I was starting to count those hours. And I realized, holy God, this isn't good. And I dumped them down the toilet. It scared me. I had never felt that way. I never felt what it could be like and how easy it was to just keep taking them.
Right.
Because it really made me feel good. And that was scary.
And I think for the very reason you're describing, I think she's very sympathetic to, she says, when, you know, people, when they talk to her about what she does, they want reassurances from her that, you know, like that it's not a disease, that, you know, these people that are addicted, they just made bad choices. And she's saying, no, they want reassurances. These people, they want to believe that they have loved enough, that they have raised their children well enough, that the things that I research will never, ever touch their lives. But the truth is, they do. There's no way to reassure somebody that this will never happen, you know? So she's very sympathetic to exactly that, how easy it is to get started on that. And the other point I think she makes so beautifully is that when we think about people, we remember them with that they're addicted. We forget how sweet and wonderful and generous and kind they were in their lifetime, how accomplished they were perhaps. But instead we remember, oh yeah, he died of an overdose. And unfortunately that's a fact. So I think that she has a lot of intended messages. Any other takeaway message you got from the story?
I'll be Debbie Hoffman because she's on mute, but Lynda P wrote in the comments, I think she is also dealing with the idea if we have control over addiction. So I don't know, that like how we don't have control.
What do we mean by that? Do we have control over addiction?
To some extent, I think we do. It depends how early you realize, like, is it Kathy who said she knew something was wrong?
Yeah.
She knew this was not good. There are not enough people like that, and they expect instant gratification from a pill, and they don't have to do anything. And I'm really sad because I think that too many people believe that. And we need more people who don't.
Right.
Having suffered from food addiction most of my life, and I was in 12-step programs, which is a branch of Alcoholics Anonymous. They say that alcoholics take a tiger and put it in a cage, but foodaholics take that tiger and take it for a walk 3 times a day. And so they feel that food addiction is the hardest addiction because you have to eat, you know, to live, where you give up cigarettes or you give up drugs even, and alcohol, but you can't give up food. So you have to make that choice. You have to think, you have to keep your mind going.
Right.
And so that's one of the important things about addiction.
Right.
Lynda,
Any other takeaway messages from the story as a whole?
Lynda, you ask about takeaway messages, and I know that this may sound a little fluffy, but the one thing that kind of gave me hope through all of it, and it made me realize that everybody deals with things and life will go on, was my favorite quote out of the book was, "We knew our mother would kill us if we died." Now, who hasn't said that about their own mother or their kids who thought about it? And I thought that just summed up family life, no matter hard or not hard, good, bad, it's just family. And I liked that. That was a good takeaway for me.
That's a good takeaway, yeah. I love it. You could pull out so many different things that were wonderful takeaways. I happen to have loved this one because my takeaway message was that these are universal questions that we all struggle with, you know, like with God, with faith, with science. People always say, well, do you believe in, evolution versus faith versus, so I love the part where she says, Neither science nor faith can hold all of the answers. The age-old question of life's meaning is still unknown to us. And Gifty says, the truth is we don't know what we don't know. We don't even know the questions we need to ask in order to find out. And I love the way she says this. But when we learn one tiny little thing, a dim light goes on in a dark hallway and suddenly a new question appears. We spend decades, centuries, millennia trying to answer that one question so that another dim light will come on. That's science, but that's also everything else, isn't it? Try, experiment, ask a ton of questions. I thought that was really a good way to put it because there are so many questions and they are universal. And I think that's one of the reasons why, again, this book has been so well received. Any other thoughts?
Have you read The Homegoing? Have you read her other book?
I have not, but I'll tell you, it sounds like something I'm going to want to read. So I will let you know. Anybody who wants to go ahead and read it, go ahead and read it, and perhaps suggest that we do that as one of our books because it really sounded quite good.
Right.
I wanted to, number one, thank you, Jillian, for stepping in there for me a second. I was taken away, but I appreciated that. And second of all, just want to thank everybody for being here today with us, and Lynda, especially you for leading. It was a tough book, and but you, as always, make it. I think we can see different things through your eyes, and thank you for giving us that other perspective. And I just wanted to encourage everybody to sign on again with us next month when we review, Lynda will review, she will lead that discussion of the Book of Lost Names by Kristen Harmel. The registration is not up right this second, but it should be up by tomorrow morning. So just check back at bpjcc.org. We will be sending it out in our weekly newsletter, so you'll see it there, and we'll send it to the Friends of the Sterling Road Library, and they'll add it to their newsletter. So the link will be up very soon for you to be able to register. And as always, we thank our friends at the Sterling Road Library for partnering with us today, and thank you all for taking the time to be here. Have a great
Thank you, everybody, for your comments. It adds so much when we read these books together and we have the chance to discuss them. So
It was great, Linda. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy
Thanks, guys.
Thanksgiving.
See you next month. I know you're going to enjoy the next book. Really,
Yeah, it was great.
Really
It's a great book.
Okay.
I love it.
I love it.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Lynda.
Yeah.
Hold on one sec. We'll wait till
Leave.
Oh, okay.